we're going to be exploring the serialization, so using the JSON object in JavaScript to stringify. So that's converting a JavaScript object into a string version of itself. So we've got an example here where we've got the JavaScript object and we're using the JSON Stringify. So it's what it's doing is it's converting it into a string version. And then also using JSON parse to convert a JSON structured string into a JavaScript object. And that's going to once again make it usable so that we can interact with the data contained within the object. The JSON object in JavaScript contains methods for either parsing JSON JavaScript object or converting a string into a usable JavaScript object or converting a JavaScript object into a string. So first off, let's create our object, and this is going to be actually an array of object items. So create a bunch of items within the object, and these are all going to be objects, and let's comma separate them. So just have a bunch of first names, and then that will give us a way that we can easily loop through the contents. And that gives us a list of first names that we can select from the array. Let's output the array into the console. And there's our usable JavaScript object where we can select any one of the items using its index value and then selecting out the value using the property name. So that can return back the contents of the array and then get the array item with the index value and then return back the value that's associated with the property name. So if we want to convert this into a string format, and sometimes when you do get the JSON data, when you're connecting to it from a website, it comes back as a string. So then you need to take the string and convert it into a usable format. So first off, we're going to create it and bring it into a string. So in order to convert it, we can use the JSON Stringify method and then set the array object within there. And now when I output the result for string 1, we get this type of result. So that means that this is a string and it's just being represented as a string. So we can't do anything with it. If we want to take the value of the string and we want to get the first item with the index value of 0, it's going to not return anything back. It's going to actually use the string method and return the first character in the string, and that's why we get this type of bracket. So we can't select contents of the string. We can't do very much with the string contents. We can't select the object information. So this won't return anything. It's just going to return back undefined because there's nothing being defined within this structure. So it's not able to find anything within the string that suits that. So we want to turn it back into a JavaScript object, and there's a method in order to do that, and that's the JSON parse. And what that will do is that will take the string and convert it back into a usable JavaScript object. So now when we look in the console, we're back at a JavaScript object, and once again we can make a selection using the index and the property name, and that's going to return back the matching result. These two are no longer going to be, although they're going to hold the same data, they're no longer going to be joined because this is actually going to be a separate item. It just so happens to have the same data. So if we make any updates to array 1, and let's add in a new item with the index value of 5, and this is going to be a new object that adding in there. So let's keep the same structure of first and then a name. And that actually should be a colon, so it's throwing an error there. When I output into the console log the result for that array, and then also the result for the new object that we created, now they're going to hold different data. So the first one, the original array that we have with the items, had that new item added to it, and the second one that we converted into a string and then back into a usable JavaScript object is going to be a completely separate entity, and that's why it's not being updated. So they're no longer linked, they're no longer syncing themselves together. If you do create a string, and if you update the string, so let's take the new string, let's call it string 2, and then we've got the result for string 1, and we'll create a new object out of that, so parsing it, and then we'll log out the result of that into the console. So that will be the JS object 2. And then we want to see the output of JS object 2 in the console. So save that. And now when we look at that, that works. We've got the string, we've created a brand new object, and this one as well is going to be separate from the JS object 1 because it's taking string data and it's converting it into a JavaScript object. And this actually should be using the value for string 2. So that's our new object that we've created, and we're basing it off of what we've got for contents of string 1. So now let's make an update to string 1. We'll output string 1 into the console so that we can see the result for what we've got for the string. So this is that string containing the contents that we have from the original object array. What if we add to the string? And I'm going to add in a second array. So what happened is that we ended up getting this type of error. As we're trying to parse this back into a usable format, we're not able to, because this is the string format, and now we've added in this set of characters, and this will happen no matter what we add in, as it's not going to be a valid JSON object, unless of course it's a space, and at that point we're still able to convert it back. So JavaScript's going to do its best to convert it back into an object, but if you have any extra characters, that's going to throw the whole process off, and it's going to make it that it's not going to be able to parse through and extract out the contents of it. If we wrap it within a proper structure, so if this is going to be an object, as an object, it's still not going to be correct because we don't have the proper structure for the object. If this was an array, and we're closing it off with an array, so it's an array nested within another array, that's going to work, where we've got an empty array, that's the parent array, nesting the new content in it. So you do have to make sure that the structure that you have for the string is going to be able to be converted into an object. If it's not, then you're going to see some error messages as you're trying to convert it. So once it's within that object format, then once again we can make use of the content. And now that we've nested it within another object, we need to select the main parent object first, and then we can select the nested items that are contained within there. So the same way that we were making the selection using the index value of 0, because we do have the one item within the object, and that's going to be all of the contents. That's going to be that second array that's contained in there, and that's what we're referencing using the index of 0. And then the content inside is going to be the array of object items, and that's going to be returning back that first item. And if we want to get the first name now, let's set that and select the first name from it. So that's why it's important when you are trying to use the JSON parse, make sure that the structure is a proper JSON structure in order to be able to turn it into a JavaScript object. If we do have a JavaScript object, one that's going to be just a JavaScript object, so this isn't going to be in a JSON structure. I'm going to use the quotes around it, and we'll use the single quotes here. Well, if I output into the console, it's already going to treat it the same way. If I take this value and if I convert it into a string, third string, using the JSON Stringify, we're going to stringify the object contents, output that into the console, and that's actually going to be the console log string 3, and then we'll convert it into a JavaScript object, so JavaScript object 3, and use JSON parse to bring it back into a usable structure. And now let's output the result into the console. And we'll take a look at what happened behind the scenes where JavaScript actually converted the object, as we can see in the console on line 31, where we've got the string and we did the JSON Stringify of the object, and it added in the double quotes. So it actually structured it as proper JSON, which it wasn't. It was a JavaScript object, and it read through it and updated it, adding in the quotes where it's necessary. So even though if we were to paste this into a lint, this wouldn't come back as proper, the string version of it, the stringified version, would. And then as we parse it back into a JavaScript object, then we see all of the properties and values that we can interact with. There's several JSON validators that are online, and they're really easy to use. Just Google it. The one that I'm on is at jsonlint.com. So if I take this JavaScript object and if I try to lint it and I validate the JSON, we see that we've got an error. If we do have valid structure, and that's not going to be including the semicolon. If you include the semicolon, then you're going to throw an error, because once again, that's not going to be valid JSON. So this one is valid JSON, and the string version of the one that was a JavaScript object, if we paste that, validate JSON, it's going to restructure it, and it is going to come back as valid JSON. So the Json Stringify converts the JavaScript object into string version, but it's going to be a valid JSON string version of it. It also breaks apart the object so that it's a lot easier to read, where it breaks apart the key names and then associates the values there and wraps it with the curly brackets. So if you have a really long JSON object, you can put it into a lint, validate it. As it validates it, also makes it a lot easier to read.